Frumentum, vis grain ration. Grain was the absolute core of the Roman soldiers' diet, and the numbers behind it reveal just how much of military logistics actually revolved around feeding bread to an army. In the 2nd century BC, each Roman soldier received roughly 66 pounds of wheat per month, issued whole rather than milled, which meant the soldier himself was responsible for grinding it into flour. By the later imperial period, sources put the daily allotment at around 1.5 kilograms of grain per man. The grain was typically wheat, though barley appeared during shortages, and barley carried a stigma, since Roman military culture considered it animal feed and sometimes issued it specifically as a punishment ration instead of wheat. Each unit of 8 soldiers, called a contubernium, processed and prepared their grain together, since there was no central mess hall in a Roman camp or fort. The cost of these rations, roughly 60 denarii per year, was deducted directly from each soldier's pay. This single ingredient made up an estimated 75% of everything a legionary ate, which means understanding Roman military food really means understanding what they did with that grain once it left the sack. And the most basic answer to that question came in the form of a thick, unglamorous porridge that soldiers ate every single morning. Puls, a field porridge. Puls was the simplest possible use of a soldier's grain ration. Boil it in water, sometimes with milk if it was available, until it thickened into a dense porridge. It required no oven, no bakery, and no time spent waiting for fermentation or rising. Just a fire, a pot, and ground or cracked grain, which made it the default breakfast across the entire Roman army, regardless of where a unit happened to be stationed. Soldiers ate it plain when supplies were tight, or improved it with whatever fat, cheese, or vegetables happened to be on hand that day. The historian Pliny the Elder noted that Romans as a whole had eaten Puls as their dominant food for centuries before bread culture fully took over civilian life, and the army's continued reliance on it reflects how deeply practical Roman military food culture remained, even as elite civilian cooking grew increasingly elaborate. It was the ration that required the least preparation and the least equipment, which is exactly why it survived as a battlefield staple long after more sophisticated bread had become standard at home. But grain wasn't only eaten soft and boiled. When a unit needed food that could survive weeks in a pack without spoiling, the army had a completely different, far harder solution. Bucellatum, hardtack. Bucellatum was Roman military hardtack, a biscuit made from flour, water, and salt, baked once and then baked again at a lower temperature, specifically to drive out every trace of remaining moisture. That double baking process is what gave it such an extraordinarily long shelf life, capable of surviving harsh weather and extended campaigns without spoiling, at the cost of becoming nearly rock solid. The Codex Theodosianus, a Roman legal text from the 4th century AD, specifically lists Bucellatum alongside bread, wine, vinegar, and salted pork as standard issue, and notes that hardtack paired with sour wine was considered sufficient provisioning for 2 full days in the field. Soldiers typically softened it by dunking it directly into wine, vinegar water, or broth, since eating it dry risked cracking a tooth. It was specifically designed as an emergency and transit food, something a soldier could carry for weeks without worrying about decay, in exchange for sacrificing almost everything about texture and flavour. Every ration also depended on a steady supply of fat and protein, and the army's answer to that came in a form that could survive the road just as well as hardtack did. Laridum, salted pork/bacon. Laridum, salted and smoked pork, was the primary source of fat and protein in the standard Roman military ration, and the Codex Theodosianus and the Historia Augusta both name it specifically, alongside bread, hardtack, wine, and vinegar as core legionary provisions. Romans strongly preferred pork over beef in general, and the army's reliance on bacon specifically came down to practicality. Smoking and salting made it far easier to transport over long distances than other fat sources like olive oil, which had to be carried in fragile clay amphora or heavy barrels. A single ration of smoked bacon delivered a dense concentration of calories in a compact, durable package, which mattered enormously for an army that might march 20 miles in a day carrying its own supplies. Fresh meat did appear in legionary diets when circumstances allowed, Archaeological evidence from sites like the fortress baths at Caerleon shows soldiers eating substantial amounts of chicken. But Laridum was the reliable, non-perishable baseline that every unit could count on, regardless of location or season. Pork fat alone wasn't enough to make hardtack and porridge palatable day after day, though, which is where the army's supply of a sharp, acidic liquid became essential to actually getting calories down. Posca is vinegar water. Posca was the standard drink of the Roman soldier, made by mixing vinegar with water, sometimes with herbs added for flavour. It served a function far more important than simple refreshment. Drinking water on campaign was frequently contaminated, and the acidity of vinegar killed many of the pathogens that made untreated water dangerous in the field. The Codex Theodosianus specifically pairs Bucellatum with acetum, sour wine vinegar, as the standard 2-day field ration, treating the drink as essential infrastructure rather than an afterthought. Roman soldiers also carried regular wine, called vinum, but Posca was the everyday workhorse, cheap, shelf-stable, and effective at making questionable water safe to drink. The drink shows up far beyond military logistics too. In the New Testament, the liquid offered to Christ on the cross is described using the Greek word for posca, a detail that places this humble soldier's ration directly inside one of the most referenced scenes in Western literature. Posca kept legionaries hydrated and functioning across the empire's harshest frontiers, but soldiers needed more than bread, fat, and vinegar water to actually stay strong, which is where a completely different category of the ration came in. Legumes, lentils, chickpeas, broad beans. Legumes, primarily lentils, chickpeas, and broad beans, were a standard component of the Roman military diet specifically because they solved a logistics problem that fresh meat and vegetables couldn't. Dried legumes, stored for extremely long periods without spoiling, resisted pests reasonably well, and could survive harsh climates and rough transport conditions far better than perishable foods. They were typically boiled into stews, sometimes combined with whatever salted meat or vegetables were available that day, providing protein and fibre to round out a diet that was otherwise dominated by grain and fat. This wasn't a minor supplement. Legumes were resilient enough that Roman quartermasters could stockpile them in advance and distribute them confidently, even when fresh supply lines were unreliable, which made them a strategic asset as much as a nutritional one. Unlike grain, which needed to be ground, or hardtack, which needed to be soaked, legumes required only water and time over a fire, making them one of the simplest hot meals available in a Roman camp. But a soldier's ration wasn't only about calories and survival. There were ingredients included specifically to make all of this taste like something worth eating. Moretum, herb cheese spread. Moretum found its way into the legionary diet as one of the few rationed items whose entire purpose was flavour rather than survival. It was a thick paste made by grinding fresh cheese together with garlic, herbs, olive oil, and a splash of vinegar. Essentially a portable condiment that turned plain bread or hardtack into something with real character. Roman writers documented it as a staple of ordinary civilian life as well, but its presence in military food culture reflects how seriously Roman quartermasters took the question of morale, not just calories. A soldier eating bland boiled grain and tough dried meat day after day on campaign needed something to break the monotony, and a sharp, garlicky cheese spread did exactly that with almost no logistical cost. Cheese and herbs stored reasonably well, and the paste itself required no cooking. It's a small detail in the broader ration system, but it tells you that even Rome's most utilitarian field diet had room for at least one ingredient whose entire job was to make the rest of the meal more bearable. If you love ancient history and unique food culture, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell. See you next video.